When I think of esports, there's usually one thing that I think about. It's the game League of Legends. And the reason for that is because League of Legends is one of the biggest esports in the entire world. It's there on a global scale. People all around the world who play it, there's people all around the world who watch it. And even though I don't really play League of Legends anymore, I will still tune in to their world championships because I am just part of their ecosystem, I guess. League of Legends essentially brought together the idea that esports can be on a bigger scale, that it can be on that global stage and can sell out entire arenas like Madison Square Garden. They were essentially pioneers of esports. And if you don't know what's going on in League of Legends, allow me to explain. In most of League's regions, they have what's called a Challengers League or Academy teams, and these basically work as farm teams or development teams where it's a lower league. If you're familiar with Rocket League, it's like the RLRS, or, you know, a better example would be in the NBA, they have the G League, or in MLB, they have like AAA, which is like the minor leagues. It's essentially a development league where teams have ownership of these like lower teams where these teams can practice, become better, and hopefully make it to the big leagues one day to make it to the NALCS. Another important piece is the NALCS is a franchise league. And if you don't know what that means, it essentially means that a couple years back, maybe 8-9 years ago, orgs had to pay about $10 million to get a spot in the league. These orgs own the spot. They can't be relegated. They can't lose the spot unless they sell it, or I guess unless the entire esport just dies. That's another way they could probably lose it as well. But teams had to pay for these spots, which means teams have complete ownership of the spot, which means they could swap out players when and if they please. And that also means it comes with a little bit of rules and a rule set that, teams, orgs, players, Riot, they all have to follow and be cohesive with each other. One of these rules was that if you owned an LCS spot and an LCS team, you also had to field an NACL spot, the North American Challengers League, which is the league below the LCS. Now, orgs that are a part of LCS ended up going to Riot and saying that, hey, this Challengers League is not cost effective. It's costing us way too much money. A lot of players don't even come up through the league anymore. We shouldn't have the requirement to have to sign and pay all of these players in the Challenger League because it's just not worth it to us. So Riot receives that complaint and they say, okay. Now, they didn't necessarily say to get rid of your teams, but they just said you didn't have to have one. So immediately, 7 out of the 10 LCS teams immediately drop their Challenger League teams, and they just basically get rid of it. I saw some tweets saying that there was essentially like 70 jobs. So you got to assume, it's players and coaching staff, and then I assume there's other staff involved as well with these Challenger League teams. So 70 jobs immediately are just like gone overnight because it just wasn't feasible, it wasn't affordable. And so from a financial standpoint, it pretty much makes sense. If something's not making financial sense, you have to cut costs somewhere, then get rid of the thing that's just losing money. And that's what a lot of teams did. But people aren't necessarily upset about that specifically, and maybe some people are. But the biggest thing is the poor planning from Riot, where they just essentially said, okay, you don't have to have these teams, and then overnight, the teams were gone. I want you to listen to this clip from Steve. He's the co-CEO of Team Liquid, talking about the pricing of their academy team.
It's important to talk a little bit about costs and how much is being spent. We'll be super transparent. This year, we will spend approximately $675,000 in total on all of academy. That includes our players and housing and food and travel, visa, immigration costs, if there are any.
$675,000. Please look at this average viewership and tell me where the $675,000 is going. These teams play for about 7 weeks at a time, and you don't really know the hours watched, but it definitely ain't worth $675,000, I'll tell you that much. And also, if there's overspending happening in the lower league, there's probably overspending happening in the upper leagues too. The upper league is what they care about more. So imagine what they're spending up there. And this goes on to a topic I want to talk about later in the video about esports as a whole, but we'll get into that a little later. So the Challenger League teams are gone, essentially just vanished overnight. Pretty big deal. And the LCS also has a players association, and this players association decided to run a vote with the 50 players in the LCS, the above league. And this vote was for a walkout as a form of protest. It's like a labor strike. If the workplace doesn't help out its workers, the workers aren't going to show up. You need to throw us a bone here, and essentially there's a negotiation that happens, and hopefully there's a middle ground that is found. Well, the vote ends up going through, and it overwhelmingly passed, which means obviously a large majority of the players voted. So the walkout ends up happening, and Riot is now forced to respond. The Players Association had 5 requests. I want you to guess how Riot responded. First and foremost, here are the requests. They said that they want a Valorant-style promotion relegation system where teams go from the upper leagues to the minor leagues if they do bad, and from the minor leagues to the big league if they do good. They want Riot to guarantee LCS minimum contracts to the 5 players who win the Challenger League Summer Finals. They want a 3/5 continuity rule so players basically have priority in maintaining their roster, because right now you can win and just basically the whole team get replaced. They want Riot to commit to a revenue pool of player salaries of $300,000 per Challenger League team per year. Also, a side note to that, Riot already pays these teams anywhere from $1.5 million to $3 million per year. And they want to allow LCS orgs to partner with affiliates for cost sharing. Now, I mean, that one seems normal. I was actually surprised that was even one to begin with, but there it is. So here's what Riot says. No. Basically, no, you're not going to get what you're asking for. We're going to extend this period for 2 weeks, though, but also keep in mind that there is an obligation for LCS teams to field a completed roster. So what Riot does is they remove the rank requirement, and I think the rank requirement was there, so like if you're a bad LCS team, you don't just like sign Mr. Beast to play in your last game of the season or something like that. But they essentially got rid of that, and they just made it extremely easy for teams to field their roster for the upcoming Challenger League that's in 2 weeks. Now, the Players Association is in contact with LCS, and they're supposed to be having daily meetings trying to resolve the conflict. Hopefully they can find some sort of middle ground, but that is the whole ordeal as of right now. We're now later in the video, so let's talk about what I was talking about earlier in the video with the Challenger League salaries being absolutely insane and essentially inflated salaries. Apparently, per sources, salaries have drastically reduced in the LCS this year. And the reason I'm bringing this up, and I'm going to bring it like, I'm going to cross-reference it, is because I think the LCS and Riot Games and League of Legends in general are the forefront. They're the pioneers of esports in general. They're the top. You know, people say trickle-down economics. Some people say it's a meme, whatever. But I think what LCS does definitely sets a standard for esports as a whole. And if you're starting to see people cost-cutting in one of the biggest esports, that means that, you know, teams have essentially overextended. The VC money is no longer just funneling in, and it's going to create basically a downswing in like esports salaries and, you know, hirings and all that stuff. But at the same time, I do think, you know, without the VC money funneling in, it is a much more healthy, a much more sustainable way to actually grow esports as a whole. And I've talked about this in the past with Rocket League salaries. I said that I think they were partially inflated at the time, and I don't know anything about salaries going down, but what I do know is there's not any random ass orgs coming in with just millions of dollars just trying to sign any team that they can get and getting absolutely nothing in return. Because the whole thing is so many of these orgs had so much money that was just being funneled in, and they needed to compete, and they needed to constantly compete with each other. And so even in that sense, you would basically have orgs fighting over paying a player's salary. And there are reports as well in the LCS where players are getting way too much money because the orgs themselves were kind of just fighting each other. They're just like dog fighting. Hey, we'll pay this player $500,000 a year. No, we'll give him $1 million. We'll give him $1.5 million. And instantly like that, you're paying 200% more than maybe the player's already worth. And the conversation of worth is extremely important because at least to me, you know, when I'm looking at the LCS and when I'm looking at Riot, in the grand scheme of things, League of Legends is on a global scale. They are huge in Asia, and the LCS is such a small portion. If there's a walkout in LCS and they don't play in the summer split and then they don't go to Worlds, NA never even does good at Worlds anyway. It's not like they're even missing like their main function of their esport, their mainstay. Like, sure, the NA fans might be upset, but they're always upset anyway. NA doesn't ever do anything. The best result that NA has gotten at Worlds is that they made it to the semifinals. That's it. They made it 4th place. So there legitimately could be a world where Riot doesn't even feel like they need the LCS, which is why they're just saying, hey, you have to field a roster. You guys have 2 weeks, and they're completely strong-arming. They could be bluffing, but at the same time, like, are they? Do you really think they are? And I don't know the whole economic landscape of things, especially in League of Legends, but I would assume that the world stage is one of the biggest things for a League of Legends sponsorship, for a org to not to get a sponsor, but for a sponsor to actually be happy at the end of the day and want to re-sign with them. The thing is, orgs, you know, players could walk out and then orgs could pressure the players to be like, hey, you actually have to play in this. But the thing is, the orgs are getting pressure from the sponsors, the ones who are actually giving them money to be able to stay afloat. And if a team doesn't end up going to Worlds because of a walkout, the sponsors are going to end up walking out. So at the end of the day, the sponsors are going to be the ones pushing these guys. And I think Riot knows that as well, that these orgs need to go to Worlds regardless to even have a chance at, like, you know, basically maintaining their costs. So looking at all the drama in Black and White, it's just one big game of leverage, and Riot Games knows that they have a lot of leverage here. They know that players are going to get pressure from the orgs are going to get pressure from the sponsors, and Riot is kind of just sitting there strong-arming because, I mean, they know the risk involved, but at the same time, I do feel like they're in complete control. One big game of leverage, and that's basically it.